Some things are never meant to be found. This is one of them. Mara had always loved things with history. Old books, vintage telephones, forgotten toys, faded photographs, anything that carried a story inside it, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. It wasn't just a hobby. It was a dream she'd been building for years, a private museum, one day, filled with pieces so rare that people would stop mid-step and ask, "Where did you even find this?" She lived in a place most people couldn't believe existed, a home built into the side of a mountain, carved from a natural cave. From outside, it looked like nothing more than stone and shadow. Inside, it was warm and beautiful, high rock ceilings catching soft hidden lighting, wooden shelves lined with glass display cases, thick rugs over stone floors, and the quiet hum of a home that felt like a museum you were lucky enough to live inside. She heard about the estate through a local collectors group. A family had lost their elderly relative, and rather than throw away decades of belongings, they decided to donate them furniture, old radios, boxes of photographs, and, tucked among faded quilts in the corner of a room, a doll. Mara noticed her immediately. The doll was beautiful porcelain face, soft and pale, with delicate hand-painted features and glass eyes so clear they almost looked wet. Her hair was real, impossibly well preserved, styled in a fashion decades out of date. Her dress was hand-stitched, every seam precise, the kind of craftsmanship that simply didn't exist anymore. For her age, she was in extraordinary condition, too extraordinary, if Mara had let herself think about it. But she didn't. She only thought, "This is one of the rarest pieces I will ever own." While examining her, Mara noticed a small tear in the fabric along the doll's upper back, barely more than a loose stitch. Curious, she peeled it open just slightly, expecting nothing. Carved into the porcelain beneath was a single number. 9. No maker's mark. No signature. No date. Nothing else on her at all, just that one number, pressed into her back as though it had always been part of her. Mara turned the doll over in her hands for a long moment, trying to place it. A production number, maybe. A collector's mark. Part of a numbered set. She searched what little history she could find on the doll's origin. The family barely remembered where it had come from, only that it had always been in the house. Mara found no answers. Only more questions. She brought the doll home that night, and placed her in the most prominent spot in her collection room, a lit glass case near the center of the room, where the light caught her face just right. For weeks, everything was wonderful. Mara photographed her, researched her, showed her off to a few collector friends who were, predictably, envious. She was, without question, the finest piece Mara had ever found. It was almost a month before she noticed the first small thing. She walked into the collection room one afternoon and paused. The doll seemed to be facing a slightly different direction than she remembered leaving her. Not dramatically, just a few degrees. She adjusted it back herself, telling herself she must have bumped the case while dusting. The next day, it had shifted again. She started to doubt herself. Maybe I moved her and forgot. Maybe I'm remembering wrong. It was such a small thing. It didn't feel like something worth worrying about. But it kept happening. She began locking the display case, certain that would end it. A week later, she opened the case to clean the glass, and found the doll facing the opposite direction from how she'd left her, inside a case that had remained locked the entire time. Around then, she began hearing things. Faint sounds from the collection room, late at night, something like fabric shifting, or the softest creak of old joints settling. Every time she checked, the room was still. Nothing out of place. Nothing she could point to and say, There, that's what I heard. She started to feel watched whenever she was in that room. Not overtly, the doll's eyes never seemed to follow her, not exactly. It was something quieter than that. A sense, low and constant, that she was no longer alone when she stepped inside. She began photographing the doll every day, time-stamping the images, trying to prove to herself that nothing was changing. Most days, the photos matched. But every so often, she'd find one that didn't quite align with her memory, a hand positioned slightly differently, a fold of fabric she didn't recognize. She couldn't always tell if the doll had moved, or if she simply hadn't been paying close enough attention the day before. That uncertainty became its own kind of fear. Not fear of the doll, fear of her own mind. She dug deeper into the doll's past, contacting the family again, searching auction records, antique registries, anything that might explain the number or the doll's origin. She found almost nothing. One old estate inventory, decades old, listed a doll matching her description in a single line, without explanation, no name, no maker, no story. It only deepened the question she couldn't stop asking herself. Why was that number carved into her? She never found an answer. One evening, alone in the collection room, cataloging a new piece, she heard it. A voice. Quiet. Close. Closer than it should have been, given that she was the only person in the house. Don't move her. She spun around. The room was empty, exactly as it had been a moment before. The doll sat motionless in her case, glass eyes catching the low light. Mara didn't sleep in that room again. She decided, finally, that she needed to let the doll go, though even then, some part of her didn't fully believe it would work. She couldn't bring herself to donate her back into circulation, to let this find its way into someone else's home the way it had found hers. Instead, she drove 2 hours to a private storage facility on the far edge of the city, one she'd never used before, and sealed the doll inside a container, under a name that wasn't her own. She drove home that night feeling, for the first time in weeks, like she could finally breathe. 3 days later, going through an old box of research materials she'd gathered on the doll, she found a photograph she didn't remember collecting, a faded, decades-old picture from the estate she'd never been given, tucked between 2 unrelated documents. In it, a woman she didn't recognize stood in an old parlor, and on a shelf behind her, barely in frame, sat the doll. The photograph was dated nearly 60 years before the family had ever owned the house. Mara stared at it for a long time, the storage receipt still sitting on her desk beside it. How long had this doll been passing from house to house, waiting to be found? She never returned to the storage facility. She left the city not long after, and quietly stepped away from collecting altogether. Friends assumed it was burnout, the kind that eventually catches up to anyone who spends their life surrounded by other people's forgotten things. The storage facility, like most, eventually resold abandoned units whose fees went unpaid. Months later, a young antiques dealer opened container after container of unclaimed goods, searching for anything worth reselling. In one, beneath a layer of old quilts, she found a doll porcelain face, soft and pale, glass eyes so clear they almost looked wet. She lifted it carefully, turning it over in her hands, already imagining where it might sell. She never noticed the small tear in the fabric along its back.
The Ninth Whisper.